In this session, we're going to discuss how the notion of swing and the rhythmic approaches to swing impacted other forms of music, including Western country and Western music, and then also Latin music. Latin music, of course, has an element that's very much a part of swing. Remember that the early jazz bands were largely divided into hot, sweet, and Latin bands, right? With the Latin bands or the Latin numbers being less often played, but sometimes just as successful, as we saw with Xavier Cugat and Aspiazzu. We saw that there were some very highly successful Latin band orchestra leaders or group leaders. And we're going to continue to see how Latin bands interact with jazz here in this session, along with how swing music had an impact outside of Latin music and outside of jazz in general, which is Western and country music. Now, this will involve, to a certain extent, leaving the boundaries of the United States in order to get a sense of other forms of Latin music in the way that they impacted the U.S. So let's begin there. In the 1930s and 1940s, there was an influx of immigrants from Latin America to New York and LA and other cities, but the documentation that you read shows that there's a huge spike in those two cities. Tango is now out of fashion. Remember that tango was something introduced at the turn of the 20th century and was popularized in part by the castle couple, the castle dancers, and then spread from there. But now it's somewhat out of fashion, and other genres like the Cuban son, danzón, and bolero were common and led to the rise of mambo and Latin jazz, and then also later, in the late 60s and early 70s, salsa. And we'll talk about that next semester. Brazilian music also began to appear. And so a lot of composers, like for instance Cole Porter writes Begin the Beguine, right? So they're drawing on the dance rhythms of the beguine. That was a very popular dance in the 30s and 40s. Calypso is very popular at this time. And then the samba. And we'll be interested in the samba first. The samba appears in the early 20th century, with Rio de Janeiro as the major center. It's an Afro-Brazilian style or genre that emerged when slave songs came in contact with urban genres like the maciço, the polka, and the lundu. This led to the samba school or samba carioca urbana style. These schools included up to around 5,000 people who competed with other schools annually during Carnival with large floats, elaborate costumes, music, and dance. So what we're talking about is, once again, just like in the U.S., Brazil had a very large slave population. Brazil is a huge country, and when it and so you have this mixture of basically immigrants with traditions and connections that go back to Portugal, right? Which is why in Brazil they speak Portuguese, and then of course you have all these African traditions from the ex-slave population. Now, as the those populations begin to mix more and more, and basically the whole end of the 19th century through the 20th century is really fascinating in Brazilian history because the populations shift so much. And next semester we'll talk about one of those major shifts that occur in the mid-50s into the early 60s when Brazil begins to try to modernize and has a sort of 5-year plan that they invoke, and they shift even where the center of power is. They shift it so that it's in the middle of the country. Right now, really, Rio de Janeiro is both the cultural and the political center of Brazil, and that's down on the coast, right? So most of Brazil is kind of alienated from the more modern parts of it. And that means that you have this very interesting mixture of more country, or let's call them rural musical styles that then impact the cities and then get transformed in the cities. So a lot of the samba has to do with these smaller enclaves in semi-rural districts that are surrounding these women, primarily women, who are priestesses in a sense of candomblé, and that's who you see here. This is Tia Ciata, and the first true samba, which is called Pelo Telefone, by telephone. The first samba that gets recorded, at least, was perhaps written by the legendary Donga. Donga is, of course, one of the great early performers of samba, and you can look him up and listen to a few of his very early, very scratchy recordings. And it appeared on recording in 1917. It seems to have derived from improvisations at the celebrations held at Tia Ciata's home. And she's a May de Santo. I called her a priestess earlier, but this is the actual term, May de Santo, which means that she has a connection with the spirits of the other world, that she's in a sense, a medium, and so she functions more or less like a priestess. And there's music surrounding. Candomblé, of course, is one of the great trance religions of the world, where the idea is that you go into a trance and you communicate with this other world, and sometimes the spirits of the other world will inhabit your body, and they use the term horse, right? So it takes you on as a horse and literally rides you, and so you take on the personality of the spirit. And Tia Ciata was apparently quite effective at allowing that to happen to both herself and her followers. So here's the typical samba rhythm, right? Bop, 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 bop. So a pretty straightforward use of syncopation. We've seen a similar rhythm, of course, in ragtime. And here you see it again in samba. That rhythm will be used in various complex ways. Sometimes it's just the underlying beat for the samba, but as we'll see, as the samba develops, it very quickly becomes, like jazz, a expansion of that rhythm so that you can use it in a polyrhythmic fashion where not everyone is playing exactly together, even though they're all alluding to that rhythm in some fashion, and there's a underlying metric stability that holds everything together. In the 1930s, we find the popularization of radio in Brazil. Remember that it's the 1920s in the U.S., but in Brazil, the radio really becomes a thing in the 1930s, and that helps make samba increasingly prominent because these radio stations are largely centered in the major towns like Rio de Janeiro, the major cities, and they invite performers from the outlying areas, especially because they don't want to pay a lot, right? So you have performers from the all around coming to play, and so samba, in a very rich sense, both the urban tradition of samba but also the more rural aspects of samba are being played on the radio. This spreads it throughout this very large country and helps to make it increasingly prominent, and really becomes the major form of popular music by the 1930s. So you have the samba canção, which is a slow and rhythmic samba with emphasis on the beautiful melody, and here you're seeing Aracy Cortez, and this style becomes popular in part because of her. In the late 20s, with the 1928 release of Ai Yo-Yo, also known as Linda Flor, or Ai Yo-Yo, right? Beautiful flower, Linda Flor. And so Aracy Cortez is one of the major performers of this period. And you can see she was, this is obviously meant to be a promotional photograph and also to be somewhat enticing. So there's the element of seduction in a lot of her songs. But they're also fun, as you'll hear when you listen to it. It's not bland music in any sense. And it's also not merely, not that torch songs are bad, but it's not merely a torch song, right? There's a driving pulse and rhythm to it. Now, by the late 30s, we also see the rise of the samba exaltação. Too many owl sounds for me in a row there. Samba exaltação. And that's a patriotic samba that controversially may have been part of the ideology of the Estado Novo of dictator Getúlio Vargas, right? So he is a dictator, and often dictators are interested in promoting a unified vision of the nation, right? Often leaders of countries speak on behalf of the nation. Sometimes they're doing that as ambassadors, and that's usually what we want a leader to do. But sometimes they're doing it to espouse ideology, saying, we all think this, meaning you must think this if you're not going to be persecuted politically. And the exaltation samba, so let's just use the English, right? The exaltation samba is a patriotic samba that is meant to glorify Brazil in various ways. And so therefore, many people think that it was more or less directly related to the dictatorship of Vargas, and therefore is somewhat politically suspect. We're going to take a look at one of the most famous of these tunes in just a moment. Here, of course, is one of the most famous performers from Brazil in the United States in the 1930s through the 50s. This is Carmen Miranda, and she really disseminated and popularized samba in her various Hollywood films of this period. And you can see she wears the fruit hat, right? That's a very typical outfit. She also wears these tops that reveal her midriff, with a lot of bracelets, as you can see, that clatter, and the huge earrings. And so she really becomes this character in U.S. films. She's often not the main star of these films. She usually has some kind of side role or secondary role, and yet it's usually kind of like the walk-on starring role where she's not in the whole film, but that moment is really a centerpiece of the film. Usually it's a musical number and a dance number, right? And she very quickly becomes popular in the U.S. As a kind of representation of this exotic notion of Brazil. Brazil has several periods of where it gains a lot of interest in the U.S., and this is one of those moments in the 30s. The next moment will come in the late 50s, early 60s, and we'll talk about that next semester with Bossa Nova. But one of the problems for Brazilians is that she becomes something of a caricature as far as they're concerned. That, the fruit especially rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And so she found herself in this very interesting position where she's living in Hollywood. Her English is broken. She can function in English, but she doesn't fluidly speak English. And so she always seems like a foreigner and is treated like an exotic foreigner. I mean, that is part of her appeal for these movies. And yet she's resented in some ways back home in Brazil because people think that what she's doing is creating this kind of caricature and reducing samba to this showy, glitzy, one-dimensional aspect of it, whereas samba obviously is part of the carnival culture, which is huge in Brazil. So it's really part of a way in which local communities represent themselves on the national stage, because carnival is a big deal. People come from all over the country to Rio de Janeiro and a few other major cities to have these huge performances. And Rio de Janeiro, as you probably know, is a huge city with these favelas, right? These smaller neighborhoods that are sometimes ramshackle. They're sometimes impoverished neighborhoods, but they're neighborhoods in which the inhabitants take a great deal of pride. And part of that pride has to do with their particular forms of dance, their particular routines, their particular approach to samba music. And so it's such a rich part of the culture, and it's not easy to summarize. You notice I'm not trying to give you definitions of what would be involved in a samba performance, because it really is an eclectic approach. That rhythm I showed you is one of the underlying bases, and a certain approach to harmony, which we will hear when we listen to the examples. But other than that, there's not a lot of generalization, and people feel that what Carmen Miranda was doing was she was sort of trying to codify a very rich practice into something very simple and one-dimensional. So we have Xavier Cugat. I mentioned him before. We've mentioned him before in the class. He was one of the, along with Don Aspiazu, one of the most famous band leaders of Latin music in the U.S. He by the time we're talking about him now, in the 1930s, he's perhaps the most popular Latin band leader. He's known as the Rumba King, even though he does a lot more than rumba. In fact, most of what he does is not rumba, but as we'll see, the rumba craze is a sort of a way of talking about Cuban music, even when it's not rumba-based. At any rate, He played out of the prestigious Waldorf Astoria Hotel from 1931 to 47. So this was one of the major gigs that you could have as a band leader. It was a very secure gig, and he was a very popular person. You can see here he's with his, I think this is his fourth or fifth wife. He married many, many times, and he was a very successful businessman, a very successful performer, and kind of a celebrity in our sense, our modern sense of the term. People knew who he was. They were interested in being at parties where he would be. Now, he said that what he was doing was he was providing a simplified Latin music for Americans who, quote, know nothing about Latin music. I gave the Americans a Latin music that had nothing authentic about it. Then I began to change the music and play more legitimately. So once again, we see the same narrative. We've seen it with Stephen Foster. We've seen it with John Philip Sousa. We've seen it with Scott Joplin over and over again. This idea that what you do is you take either a vulgar music, and that's what most of those guys were talking about, and you raise it, or you take an inauthentic version, like Xavier Cugat is talking about here, of a tradition, and you slowly introduce more and more authentic elements, right? Now, there are plenty of people who are not fans of Cugat who will say he never really played more legitimately, that it was always this kind of very broad, very watered-down version of Latin music. And others would agree with Cugat that he did get more sophisticated over time. He was certainly successful. No one can argue that. He recorded for many major labels. Dinah Shore, one of the most well-known at that time singing artists, with a very wide appeal. She started her recording career with that group, and they helped to popularize her. Desi Arnaz from the TV show I Love Lucy was in the group for a while. And he really followed trends in dance music. So he records rumbas when they were popular, mambos when they were popular, cha-chas when they were popular. He even did a twist number in the 60s. It's not particularly good. It's not particularly interesting. Of course, the twist isn't the most interesting dance in general, if you'll forgive me for saying so. It's an important one in social history, but maybe not the most musically interesting. But you can see he really tries to track the dance crazes over the course of his career. One of his most important hits, though, is from 43, and that's this one. This was number 2 on the bestsellers list, which is quite high for a Latin piece of music. And it was number 9 on the Harlem Hit Parade, which is basically the R&B charts of its time. This is 1943, and this is a song called Brazil. Now, Brazil was written by Ari Barroso in 1939, so it was written 4 years prior to this. And it inaugurated the samba exaltação style. I got closer to saying it correctly that time. The exaltation samba, this politically motivated, national pride-oriented form of samba. Right? Now, the song first gained its popularity, though, through the Disney film Saludos Amigos from 1942, sung by Aloysia de Oliveira. And you can see a little clip, and should see a little clip of that moment of Saludos Amigos when in preparation for today. So this is a previous version of the song. This is not Xavier Cugat's version that's in this film when you hear it, right? But that brought it to the U.S. national consciousness as this, and you'll hear that performance is very Disney-oriented, right? And you have the big choirs and the lush orchestration and this kind of almost dreamy atmosphere that they cultivate, right? And you'll hear that to a certain extent, Cugat does something similar. His version is a little closer to the way samba more typically is performed in sound. So that would make a nice comparison if you watched that clip and then listen to what Xavier Cugat does. These two figures are incredibly important in the expansion of Latin music in general, and certainly the expansion of its popularity in the U.S. So we have Mario Bauza and Machito, right? And they introduced mambo and Latin jazz to the U.S. And really, they're not just introducing Latin jazz; they're forming our modern notion of Latin jazz. The first tune that was properly in clave, meaning that it has both sides of the clave, not just the tresillo. So if you remember, let's revisit this. Clave is typically either 3+2 or 2+3. So the most typical is 3+2, where you have ba, 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 ba. ba, 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 right? That's your basic clave. That first part, the ba, 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 that's the traceo. And there are plenty of pieces before this that just have the traceo. Ba, 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 ba. Having both ends of the clave isn't as typical until really tanga in 1943. There are a few other isolated examples that people sometimes point to and say, actually this is the first one and so on. But this is the first tune that really takes the clave seriously as a constructive, formal impulse to the formation of the song itself, to the identity of the song. The song is about clave and its flexibility and its dynamism, right? And it's by Bauza, written by Bauza and recorded by Machito and the Afro-Cubans that same year in 1943. Let's take a closer, this is a song you should listen to very carefully. Let's take a closer look at some aspects of it. It begins, or really is in a sense, a descarga. It's a jam tune, and it begins with a distinctive ostinato, a guajeo. And you can see how this ostinato works. You basically have 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 1 and 2, and 4, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 1 and 2, and 4 in the left hand in the bass, right? And notice that the chords then emphasize that shift to the syncopation, and they also have a sort of reworked version of a clave, because a clave would normally be 1, 2, 3, and then ba. But so if you're taking the 2 side, it'll be I'm messing it up. Right? So that you have this the 2 side of the clave is usually hits on 2 and 3, but here that's clearly not true. So we're already seeing that the clave is more flexible than we sometimes think of it as being. You'll also notice that the chord progression here is oscillating between, at first, just a C and a B flat, right? In fact, that's all it does in this this portion of the tune. You just have a C and a B flat. And the second half of that emphasizes the upbeats with those chord hits, right? Now, this is just a guajeo, a formulaic ostinato, and a lot of the descargas, the jam tunes will begin with some kind of ostinato, or even just have an ostinato throughout that they can then build a larger and larger texture out of. The story is that Bauza was at a gig. He liked the guajeo that someone was playing, and he decided to, more or less in real time, create a tune, a composition out of that by directing people in what they should do over this, right? Now, Bauza really develops the clave terminology and the concept. So here we have, and you can see what I was trying to do before and messing up, the 2/3 version of the clave, where the hits are on beats 2 and 3. Not on 1 and 3 like we had in that guajeo figure on the previous slide. But that doesn't mean that you can't shift things, right? But the standard approach to clave is to have that pattern. So the 3/2 clave is the ba 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 ba, and then the 2/3 clave, that was the 3/2. The 2/3 starts with the 2, so you have the ba 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 ba. Now, of course, they become the same thing. Once you start looping it, really, if you come in the middle of something, you may not be able to tell one from the other, although if you listen carefully and you hear where the hypermeter falls, you should be able to tell. But that's kind of the trick, right? That's why some Latin music is so clever with respect to hypermeter. Even though it's dance music and it's trying not to lose you in certain ways, there are some hypermetric complexities in Latin music that are sometimes really, really interesting, really fascinating to unpack and try to get a hold of. And tanga is a good example of that. So listen carefully to that tune, and we'll talk about it some during our discussion session. Then Latin jazz begins to expand. It begins to become more of a national presence than it had been in the 20s. Part of this has to do with Stan Kenton, who had a hit with the composition Machito, obviously in homage to Machito. This was from 1946, and it was by his arranger, Pete Rugolo. I put Pet Rugolo, but Pete Rugolo. And it's considered the first Latin jazz recording by an American band. It has Ivan Lopez on bongos and Eugenio Reyes on maracas, and it's a really, you can hear the Stan Kenton style here very clearly. Stan Kenton in the 40s, this is his great period, the 40s to the early 50s, where he has this huge big band, and this is, of course, after the fall of the swing era, which we're going to talk about in more detail soon. There were very few bands that could maintain any kind of identity after that because it became difficult. Stan Kenton is one of the few exceptions there, and you can hear he's developing this very clean, very dramatic, very orchestral sound, and sometimes very experimental, including his approach to Latin music. He listens very carefully to Machito and to Balza and to other important Latin figures and tries to draw from them. Another huge moment in the development of Latin music, and specifically Latin jazz, is the collaboration between Chano Pozzo, who you see there with the drum, and Dizzy Gillespie, who you see smiling, looking up at him, and wearing his classic and characteristic beret. Dizzy Gillespie, of course, I'm sure all of you know this, but I'll say it anyway, one of the founders of the bebop style, along with Charlie Parker, and Thelonious Monk and a handful of other, Kenny Clark and so on, of other figures. Dizzy Gillespie is in some ways the most theoretically driven. That doesn't mean his music is necessarily the most complex. Thelonious Monk's music is incredibly complex when it comes to harmony and approaches to harmony. But what I mean by theoretically driven is Dizzy Gillespie is the one that gives lectures and teaches classes on jazz harmony, and is really interested in knowing it in a sort of theoretical manner, not just being able to play it or knowing it in a more practical manner, which of course is another and an important form of knowing. He becomes interested in collaborating with Chano Pozzo and integrating more Latin elements into his music. And you can hear this even before the collaboration. There are certain songs by him that incorporate more Latin elements. So let's look at their collaboration a bit. Chano Pozzo was with the Machito band, of course, and he went on to play with Gillespie, especially in the tune Cubana Bee, Cubana Bop. They first record together, though, on Manteca, and that's the one I'd like you to listen to from 1947, which features layered guajeos, so these ostinatos that are layered on top of each other. And it's a really fascinating tune to see how he builds them up, Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozzo. They build them up in order to really create this very dense texture, and then they reduce things again. And so there's this sense in which the climatic elements of the song come from textural approaches as much as from dynamics or from high notes or whatever else. The rhythm of the A section melody employs a pretty typical mambo bell rhythm, right? So if you're listening to mambo music, then that figure that you see there, which is the A section melody, that's a very typical rhythm for a bell rhythm, which you can see is summarized below it. And then the piece builds up from there. So listen to how it's constructed. You can hear it's a lot like the Balza composition. You can kind of hear how it's developing in time, how one thing is added to another. There's an additive element, but it's not additive in the sense of a Sousa march or a ragtime piece where one section is added to another. It's the idea of adding things on top of each other that's important in these songs. So then the mambo craze. Modern mambo really begins with the song Mambo, a danzón, a Cuban danzón, written in 1938 by Orestes and Cachao Lopez. But then the real craze begins in the 40s, the mid to late 40s, with Perez Prado, who moved to Mexico City to start a band playing mambos and became known as the King, El Rey del Mambo. He was inspired by the success of the Stan Kenton Orchestra, which by this point is a national phenomenon. And Prado also wants that very clean sound, but Prado, that clean sound is used in a very different way in Prado than in Kenton. Prado's recordings are meant to be somewhat sexy in a sense. So all the parts are very cleanly performed, as you'll hear, but they have a kind of slinkiness to them that is very distinct from anything Stan Kenton tried to do. So he was very interested in the success Kenton had with Cuban music, and so he begins recording, Prado begins recording for RCA Victor, and his tunes are designed for really a Latin American audience, but then they cross over, and one of the most famous is, of course, Mambo No. 5 from 1949. As soon as you play the opening few seconds of this tune, you will recognize it from commercials, from dances, from TV shows, from movies, and it's just one of those tunes that we all know, even if we didn't know the title of it. By the mid-50s, the mambo craze has taken over New York, and the Palladium Ballroom in particular, and a good tune to listen from that era would be Patricia in 1959. This is a good example of that slinkiness I mentioned. Patricia is often used. It got licensed for a lot of films, including B films that have a little more of a sexual plot, and Patricia winds up being used as kind of seduction music or representation of seduction. Now, country music in the swing era. Hillbilly music, by the time we get to the late 30s and early 40s, it's becoming known as country and western. It's being relabeled. Just like race music is no longer called race music by this point. It's called the Harlem Hit Parade. Various other terms that basically mean this is black music, but they're no longer calling it race music, because both those terms, race music and hillbilly music, were by this point considered very pejorative terms, or at least questionable terms. I mean, people still talk about at this time about the race question, but to call something simply race music seemed to in some way invalidate it. So those terms get rejected, and instead we have country and western and the Harlem Hit Parade, and we'll see that term for black music keeps continuing to develop until we get R&B, and then later it really kind of fractures into all these subgenres or even just other genres, funk and soul and so on. Now, the main trends in country music during this era is more of an emphasis on stars of the Grand Ole Opry. And the one that we're going to talk about is Roy Acuff, right? So you have less of a focus on the family side of things like we had with the Carter family, and more of a focus on these stars that have a certain celebrity, that have these hit records, that you wanna collect things that have to do with them. And Roy Acuff is one of the big ones of this particular era. So in other words, for a little while at least, the Jimmy Rogers model of the solo star driven form of country music is winning out over the more or less anonymous family version of country music represented by, say, the Carter family. There are, of course, during the 30s especially, the brother duos that we talked about already, the Dixon Brothers, Blue Sky Boys, Monroe Brothers. We've already talked about them, so we won't go back to that. But that's another trend in the 30s and 40s. Then you have, of course, the singing cowboys, and we do want to talk about them a bit today. The two big ones being Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. And then there's Western swing, and this is the big impact of swing on Western music, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, these groups, these country music groups, they all benefit from the AFM recording ban, and we're going to talk about more detail with that in an upcoming session, the next session. But just to mention it very briefly, most of these groups, both R&B, or what we would call R&B, and country music benefit from the AFM ban, because most of the groups involved here are not part of the Musicians Union, or at least they're not part of ASCAP. Some of them are part of the Musicians Union, but they're not part of ASCAP. They're not the official composers in that sense, right? They're not accepted to ASCAP. There are certain basically requirements you have to meet to join ASCAP, and one of those is, of course, you produce scores, and so you're a literate musician. And a lot of the composers in country music and in R&B, they're not writing things out. They're creating them for their own performance and for the studio, and then they perform them, and that's that. and go on performing them, and that's that. A lot of these songs weren't even necessarily registered for copyright, but that changes because of the AFM ban, and we'll talk about that soon. And then, of course, the Grand Ole Opry, which started in 1925, is becoming more and more of a major juggernaut for country music. If you're a country music performer, you need to get on the Grand Ole Opry. So here's Roy Acuff, one of the great Grand Ole Opry stars of this period. In 1932, he starts his singing career in Dr. Hauer's Medicine Show, and that's how he meets the banjoist Clarence Ashley, who I'll talk about eventually, a very important figure, although kind of not as well known now as he should be. And he learned several standard songs from Ashley. Ashley's one of the great, in my sense, repositories for country music. A lot of the songs that got forgotten for a while, he knew and taught other people, and so he taught Acuff a lot of these songs. The Medicine Show circuit, of course, is a major circuit for country music as well as R&B music. Then in 1934, he starts playing with Jess Easterday and the Hawaiian guitarist Clell Sumney as the Tennessee Crackerjacks. And they're playing on the Knoxville radio station WROL and WNOX. And he becomes recognized for his very clear voice. And when you listen to Great Speckled Bird, which is my favorite of his songs, or Wabash Cannonball, either one, you'll hear the clarity of his voice there. He begins recording in 1936, and that includes those numbers, and those are his biggest two. Great. They're both standards. Wabash Cannonball, of course, was already famous to some extent before Acuff came along, but Great Speckled Bird is very much identified with Roy Acuff. He joins the regular cast of the Grand Ole Opry in 1938, playing traditional sounding music derived from the string band tradition, and he's credited with moving mainstream country music away from the string band tradition. So he starts off from that more traditional point of view, but he begins to move it more toward a solo-focused commercial product. So instead of it being just a band where maybe multiple people sing, or maybe there is one main singer, but that singer doesn't stand out. Like, think about the Hillbillies or the Skillet Lickers. Like, I can tell you who the main singer was for the Skillet Lickers. It was Gid Tanner. But we don't usually... Sometimes you say the Skillet Lickers was Gid Tanner, but usually you just say the Skillet Lickers, and people at the time just said the Skillet Lickers. So the singer didn't stand out as the solo star, they were a group. But with Roy Acuff, there's more of a focus on just the solo star. He also founds the Acuff Rose Music Publishing Company in 1942, and this was the first publishing company based in Nashville, and it really helped to make Nashville the center of country music for the next several decades. And we'll see Nashville takes on more and more of this prominent role in the creation and dispersion of country music. Then, of course, you have the Singing Cowboys, and here's I think probably the most important. The three important figures to know, one's a group and two are solo stars, are Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, and then the Sons of the Pioneers, right? And Roy Rogers for a little while sang with the Sons of the Pioneers. And those are the three most important of the Singing Cowboy groups. But there were a ton of these, and there were plenty of other artists that sort of, at least for a while, pretended to be singing cowboys, right? So, for instance, Dean Martin, the famous jazz singer, or the member of Sinatra's crew, he has several albums where he's doing country music, and he of course featured in several country or rather Western films, and would sing these songs in those films and so on. So even though he wasn't technically or isn't usually thought of as being one of the singing cowboys, he really was. I mean, he did everything that they do. He was in films as a cowboy, singing as a cowboy in those films, and released full albums of nothing but singing cowboy music. He also had a jazz career, but that doesn't exclude him from this. So this is the rise of the singing cowboy, where you're really substituting the mystique of the West for the more restrictive morality of the South, right? So in other words, you're picking up on the Jimmy Rogers notion. Jimmy Rogers was, of course, associated more with the railroad than the West, but there was still this sense of danger of the rambling figure, and that's what the singing cowboy comes to represent. Many country stars began wearing cowboy hats, right? That wasn't typical before. You don't see any pictures of the Carter family with cowboy hats, or even Jimmy Rogers. That most he wears a railroad engineer's hat. There are very few. There might be a couple pictures of him with one, but relatively few and far between. It becomes much more typical with these singing cowboys, and then pretty much every country star has a cowboy hat at some point, right? Maybe not all the time. In 19, this image was really proliferated by Gene Autry, and he's the first huge success in this style. In 1928, he's singing on the radio in Tulsa as Oklahoma's yodeling cowboy. Notice the yodel, right? This becomes a hallmark of that sound. Again, it comes from, you guessed it, Jimmy Rogers, right? Remember all the blue yodels? Well, all of the Jimmy Rogers stuff, the blue yodels, the guitar-based self-accompaniment, all that goes into this style. The guitar in Jimmy Rogers is in some ways a little more interesting, sometimes, rhythmically at least, or metrically, than we see in the cowboy singers. They tend to be a little more regular, a little more folksy, a little more just strumming chords. But, the same basic approach comes out of Jimmy Rogers into these singing cowboys. So Gene Autry begins recording for Columbia in 1929, but it wasn't until 35 that he produced hits with songs like Tumblin' Tumbleweeds, and then later Back in the Saddle Again. And Tumbling Tumbleweeds is a example of one of those songs that a lot of people do, including the Sons of the Pioneers and so on. Autry appeared in 93 films from 34 to 53. So in a career of really 20 years, not quite 20 years, 93 films, that's huge. And he was the star in most of them. He also had his own TV show from 50 to 56, so a very prominent figure. Now, the other form of country and western music that we want to be aware of from this era, that's influenced obviously by swing, is western swing. It's a hybrid genre. It's influenced by jazz and incorporates elements of folk music, cowboy singers, polka, right? Mariachi music from Mexico, swing, and blues. So it's this hybrid music that's drawing on all these different genres. It's one of the first country genres to regularly depend on drums. For the most part, the drums were not part of country music. In fact, for a long time on the Grand Ole Opry, they wouldn't allow you to have drums. Even if you had drums on your recording, you wouldn't bring them to the Grand Ole Opry because it wasn't traditional enough, right? So even though that might seem like a very minor change to us, it was huge for the image of country music. The drums were considered too modern, too oriented toward a kind of approach to rhythm that was not of their interest. It wasn't part of the string band tradition, essentially. They also avoided electric instruments, electric amplification, and horns, and Western swing music uses those, right? So you have the electric amplification, the amplified guitar, and you can hear that very clearly on some of these recordings, and you have horns. You have much more varied instrumentation than you typically would have in country and western music. So you have the saxophone, you have the electric steel guitar, and this gives this genre of western swing a very distinctive sound that will then be influential on some later genres. So you'll hear, especially that slide sound, you'll say, oh wow, that just sounds like basic country music. Well, that's because it came out of this moment, right? That wasn't a sound in country music prior to the 30s and 40s. Now, the Western swing style is very popular in the 1930s and 40s in Texas, Oklahoma, and California. It's mostly those three states. So it's a Southwest kind of thing. It's mostly Southern California, but a little bit in the North as well. It's mostly those states, a little bit of a presence in New Mexico, Arizona, those areas, but it's mostly Texas, Oklahoma, and California. The 1944 federal law, wartime law, or tax rather, nightclub tax, against dancing venues seemed to contribute to its decline because Western swing had a lot to do with dance, perhaps not surprisingly. So when there was for a brief period of time during the war, there was a nightclub tax that was passed, basically because the idea was that you didn't want to have places that were too well lit in case there were enemy bombings, and also they were trying to focus the economy in certain ways, whether that's fair or not, and so they thought that this would be a good way of creating revenue. So the nightclubs had to pay a tax for any kind of music that encouraged dance, and there were inspectors that would even come out, right? So signs went up in the club saying no dancing, and that really restricted what kinds of bands got gigs, and so the Western swing style really suffers from this. Here we have a picture of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. They are in some ways, the inventors of the style, and they're certainly the most popular group within that style. The earliest band known for Western swing was probably the Light Crust Doughboys, and that was with Bob Wills, right? And that's in 1931, so right at the beginning of the 30s. But Wills then founded the Playboys, the Texas Playboys, in Waco, Texas, in 1933, and that's the first real strong Western swing band. Not just developing a new sound, but with that sound pretty much fully in place. By 1935, they're recording, and they have Leon McAuliffe on steel guitar. Listen to Steel Guitar Rag from 1936, and he is exceptionally skilled at this instrument. This is one of those instruments that you can learn how to play it fairly quickly, but not well. You can play basic stuff on it fairly easily if you know a little bit of guitar, but to really master it, it's such an awkward instrument. I've tried to play it several times. I have friends that play it, and they're okay, I guess, and I don't get any better certainly. But none of us have come anywhere near what McAuliffe can do on this very awkward, cumbersome instrument. So take a listen to that. The most famous song, though, is the 1940 New San Antonio Rose. This is a mixture of country swing band, swing big band music, and mariachi music. And it was their hugest hit. They recorded it a few times. Other people, like Bing Crosby, have their own version of the song. Bing Crosby's another one of those jazz singers that had some country songs and that were hits for him. So there are a lot of people that dabble in the country sound based on these successes of the country cowboy, the cowboy singer, and then the Western swing style. And you can understand why Bing Crosby and Dean Martin might gravitate. Well, actually, Dean Martin, for the most part, gravitates more toward this singing cowboy style. But you can understand why Bing Crosby might gravitate toward Western swing, since it is so closely related to basic jazz. That's it for this session, and I will see you next time.